It is a pleasure to be here in this first panel on sound memory and institutionalization of the sixth International Conference on Night Studies. I want to start by acknowledging that the task of writing history doesn't come without a big deal of procedural, scientific, and ethical challenges. Hereby, it is mandatory for me to make the disclaimer that this presentation doesn't have the expectations to be a history, with capital H, of DJing in Portugal in any sort of totalitarian attempt to write down once and for all what has never been written. History must be written by a plurality of hands, and mine are just another humble effort in trying to understand what this history can be about, pointing towards several clues that help us create what we might understand as the past of this musical activity. From here, I'm very heavy conscious of the chosen title for this presentation, and I'd like to share that maybe a title like this can sound a little bit like a stone monolith. Instead of looking at it as such, I kindly ask you to envision it more like a sketch on the historical narrative about teaching in Portugal. This presentation comes to life as a part of my PhD thesis, and given the general lack of historical point of views on the topic, there is a lot of room for further development. In this presentation, I'll make an overview on what's been happening in Portugal, delving on the different decades since the 1950s to draw a narrative arc that delivers an understanding on the growing of the DJing as a profession in this territory, while also admitting that there is room for growth and also some error or miscalculation. Before we delve into the Portuguese context, it is essential to understand the circumstances in which the concept of the DJ as a live event entertainer first emerged. The earliest known experiments in mechanically reproducing phonograms for dance purposes were carried out in 1943 by Jimmy Savile in the city of Leeds, United Kingdom. This was followed in the 1950s by the rise of sock hops in the US, social dances held in school gyms and halls with the aim of promoting radio shows and their hosts. In Jamaica, the first sound systems began to be developed, while in France, during and immediately after World War II, we can trace the early steps of DJing in venues such as La Discothèque, Eddie's, and Whiskey A Go Go. The latter remarked the beginning of the career of Regine Zilberberg, a successful entrepreneur and singer who dubbed herself the Queen of the Night. Regine introduced innovations to French boîtes by installing a dual turntable setup at the DJ booth, allowing for smoother transitions between records. In 1958, she opened her own nightclub, Chez Regine, which became the foundation of a nightclub empire with venues in prominent cities such as New York, London, and Monte Carlo. In Portugal, it was only slightly later, at least as far as we know, that nightclubs began to emerge following an entertainment model that placed less emphasis on live bands and musical ensembles and instead focused more on DJs. Two reasons emerge as the most plausible ones for understanding this shift. On one hand, the establishment of a phonographic market and the emergence of pop and rock stars fostered the development of musical trends within what came to be understood as youth culture as an identity-forming phenomenon. We can thus naturally imagine a shared desire to listen to artists such as the Beatles as a kind of simulation of the live experience, using phonograms rather than, of course, the actual Liverpool quartet. On the other hand, it is reasonable to assume that hiring a DJ was significantly less costly than hiring a live band, which in turn made it financially easier for nightclubs to operate. Unlike the earlier boîte model dating back to the 1920s, the venues opening during this period already showed, at the very least, a certain openness to using both DJs and live ensembles. Here is a list of the first most important clubs that opened during the 1960s in Portugal and that are presumed to have hosted DJs. Three of these venues, Van Gogh, Adlib, and Stones, were managed by Manuel Telecom de Sousa Eusébio, better known by his nickname Manecas Mousselec. Mousselec played a pivotal role in shaping the Portuguese nightlife scene, and he may have had none other than Regine Zilberberg herself as a kind of mentor. He was known to having been a regular customer at Chez Regine, even contacting and establishing a relationship with the Queen of the Night herself. It is not far-fetched to think that Manecas would have witnessed the success of Zilberberg's venues, given the possibility to switch between phonograms with no waiting time at all, thanks to the dual turntable system, hence bringing that system into his own clubs. I leave here this intriguing, though still unexplored connection. However, even with the fall of the Estado Novo regime in April 1974, little would immediately change in Portuguese nightlife apart from a relatively controlled opening of new WADs. Still, the DJ was beginning to draw more attention, gradually gaining some visibility in the media. After 2 decades of embryonal activity, the 1980s emerged as the definitive moment for night culture establishment, mainly in the urban areas of Lisbon, but also in Porto and other cities of Portugal. Around the Bairro Alto area, queer clubs like Finalmente and Trumps would draw the map of nightlife on Lisbon, and soon the area became the main stop spot for hanging out. Soon, the first rave prototypes would appear between 1982 and 1985 at the Neo Casapiano, some quarters to the south, at Almada Carvalhais Palace. These first attempts to extend the night until 10 in the morning were the result of the efforts shown by José Osvaldo Barbosa, commonly known in Lisbon as Zé da Guiné. An icon of Lisbon's nightlife of the decade, José would arrive in Portugal in the late 1970s, working as a bouncer in several clubs before establishing himself as a fashion trendsetter and host of the Noites Longas, these famous parties that started to bring the crowds out of Bairro Alto and into the Santos area. This type of initiative enabled the establishment of an axis in the Bairro Alto Santos area in the city of Lisbon and extended it even further west to the Alcântara region. But among the many venues that opened during the 1980s, Frágil holds a special place in DJ culture due to its appreciation of the DJ's creative role, serving as the starting point for careers of DJs like Rui Vargas and Jan Sung, now renowned DJs and current residents at Lux Frágil Club. A bit later, other iconic venues emerged as catalysts for a vibrant and evolving nightlife culture scattered across the country. Simultaneously, the music itself was also undergoing transformation. The last years of the 1980s witnessed the emergence and arrival in Portugal of genres such as house, acid house, and techno, following earlier trends in pop, rock, soul, and disco, and the first national DJing championships would appear from 1985 onwards. This proliferation of dance music genres, along with the recognition of DJing as a creative labor that required a specific set of skills, contributed to the growing perception of the DJ as an artist endowed with increasing creative power. As we transition into the 1990s, the status of the DJ as an author would allow their workplace to no longer be exclusively linked to a single nightclub, as had been the case up until then. Instead, the freelance DJ started gaining prominence. One interesting fact that reflects this change concerns the ownership of records. Initially, the DJ in residence would be allocated a specific budget by the club for purchasing records to be played there. Although the DJ would choose the records, the nightclub itself was the actual purchaser of the phonograms. In the 1990s, the situation began to change, and DJs started to acquire their own selections, treating them as creative tools for their performances, a trend that continues to this day and has only intensified with the transition to digital formats and the democratization of technology. The 1990s were finally the decades that saw the establishment of an electronic dance music culture. Inspired by the British scene, raves made their way to Portugal, bringing with them new genres such as deep house, hard house, trance, and jungle and drum and bass. Portugal increasingly entered the international circuit with the presence of DJs like Carl Cox, Richie Houghton, and Jeff Mills. The urban space expanded outwards to the provinces, and the first dance music festivals were founded, such as Neptunus and Boom, both in 1997. In this context, DJ Vibe was one of the first to stand out as a freelancer alongside Rui da Silva. Together, they formed the duo Underground Sound of Lisbon, which is recognized as one of the first musical production projects in the country. They also founded the record label Caos with António Cunha, which, alongside projects like Question of Time, X Club, and A Garagem, became one of the first Portuguese labels and promoters to explore and establish the dance music market in Portugal. DJ Vibe is not only credited as being the first freelance DJ in Portuguese soil, but also it was one of the first to try out electronic dance records that he would bring, either from his dad's shop or from his trips to Madrid or London. Vibe was one of the first selectors that would reach out to what rave culture meant in the United Kingdom from 1988 onwards, bringing that influence on underground sound of Lisbon and to the deep ends of Portuguese house music that was being produced at the time, crafting an idiosyncratic and innovative sound. In fact, it was none other than António Cunha that would push DJ Vibe to play outside of his resident role for their first ventures with Caos Records, as Cunha is credited with being the first Portuguese DJ with a commercial and entrepreneurial attitude towards this music. Along with them, several names like Nina V, Luís Leite, Jiggy, Giselle Garcia, Coltrane Crew, and many others would step into the scene. Additionally, the first specialized DJ equipment stores in the country were open, and the first magazines and radio shows entirely dedicated to the genre emerged. Hip hop began to make its first steps, and Kuduro was already being heard on the streets. It is also in this decade that electronic dance music culture reaches the Portuguese archipelagos. Madeira would start to host private parties with records brought directly from the continent by the hands of DJ Paulo Camacho and friends around 1992 or 1993. By the end of the decade, the first clubs open up, such as the Vespas Club or Marginal Club, and other names like DJ Hernandez or Lady CC appear in the landscape. When it comes to Açores, I'm on the verge of being able to write down some information concerning that region thanks to a couple of interviews that I will be doing soon. As for now, the information is very, very scarce. The first decade of the 21st century was primarily a period of transition from analog to digital equipment. Along the technological innovations, the releases of Traktor software, of Ableton Live, and the Pioneer CDJ 1000, all in 2001, were particularly relevant to the growing of the activity as it opened the doors for a democratization of DJing and electronic dance music production and enhancing its creative possibilities whether at home or in the DJ booth. The first years of the millennium were marked by a few significant events. In Porto in 2001, the first electronic dance music parade was held through the city streets, followed by Lisbon's counterpart in 2003, based on the party model imported from Berlin's Love Parade, which had been held since 1989. Rui da Silva emigrated to the United Kingdom, and in the early weeks of 2001, he reached the number one spot with his single Touch Me, which quickly became an anthem of the deep house genre. It is these new digital dynamics that will foster the emergence of new projects in Portugal, with the case of Buraca Som Sistema being particularly emblematic. Founded in 2006, Buraca Som Sistema became the Portuguese band with greatest international recognition ever. A prime example of this is their single Wega Wega, released in 2009, which topped the Spanish singles chart for 7 consecutive weeks. Buraca was a band that consistently utilized digital tools in the creation and performance of their compositions, leaving behind a legacy of sounds rooted in the African diaspora. Their influence paved the way for projects of the following decades, such as those from the Prince Discs label. Several record labels that continue to shape the national music scene were founded, and new landmark venues also emerged. Festivals and raves, such as Viana no Castelo in 2005, which later gave rise to Neopop in 2009, also continued to appear. In the early 2010s, the National Statistics Institute recognized DJing as a profession, and on the international stage, Portugal solidified its position by establishing an electronic musical language influenced by the South Hemisphere through genres such as Kuduro, Zouk, Kizomba, Funaná, Kwaito, Gom, and Baile Funk, while still coexisting with the Anglo-Saxon influences from previous decades. The label Príncipe Discos emerged as a social project promoting music creation in the peripheral areas of Lisbon. After 14 years, Prince became synonymous with the sound of Lisbon, helping to launch the careers of artists such as Nydia, DJ Marfox, among many others. This sonic convergence came to be known as Batida, a term promoted, though not exclusively, by the label, which placed the sound blending the diasporic influences with the technological and aesthetic stance of the global electronic dance music scene. Alongside this narrative, festival expanded significantly, with industrial-oriented events such as Mill and Talkfest also emerging. Independent initiatives increasingly fought for a place in local circuits, and there was a growing permeability between feminist values, LGBT plus culture, and the fight for capitalist and anti-racist decolonization with electronic dance music culture through initiatives like the Thug Unicorn parties or the founding of Radio Quântica. By the present decade, Portugal is a mandatory stop for every electronic dance music enthusiast. Alongside internationally acclaimed events like Boom, Neopop, or Sonar Festival that bring the biggest chunk of DJ superstars, the local and independent culture is a showcase of national talent within every genre in this music. As with other countries, DJs are nowadays a given. From hotel bars to clubs, raves, festivals, and after parties of all sorts, dance music occupies every spot of the sonic culture of the present. My personal enthusiasm with this music comes from finding a sound universe that mingles contemplation with body activity in a feedback chain between sound and bodies and sound again. The DJ, more than just a selector of records, acts simultaneously as shaman, cyborg, and composer. Through the headset, the DJ connects past and future, communicates with the dance floor, blends the music like some sort of magical cook, and gathers the crowd towards one communal journey in an artistic expression of the factory chain that easily attains symphonic proportions. For all this, I find electronic dance music one of the most singular and interesting musical phenomena of our time, and I believe unlocking its history is a way of dignifying and helping this music survive, expand, transform, and project itself into the future. In that sense, I hope that my project can support and solidify what electronic dance music culture means in Portugal. Thank you very much for all the attention, and I finish now my presentation.
So, hello everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. My name is Chiara de Dominicis, and today I will present a case study titled Beyond Fado, Exploring the Musical Landscape of Alfama's Santo Estêvão area, which was developed in collaboration with Manuel Garcia-Ruiz and Marco Roque de Freitas. And this case study is part of my doctoral research in ethnomusicology, which aims to compare Lisbon central and peripheral neighborhoods to examine how live music both negotiates and the pressures of gentrification and tourism and sustains cultural resilience. The case I will focus on today is Alfama, which is located in Lisbon Historical Center, and it's deeply associated with Fado as a city brand identity, particularly since Fado was inscribed on UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage List in 2011. Alfama has been framed both as a site of heritage safeguarding and as a key resource for Lisbon tourist economy. And this dominant narrative risks to reducing the neighborhood to a static. I was saying that, however, beyond Fado, Alfama hosts a plurality of musical and social practices, for example, informal gatherings, jam sessions, community concert, and small-scale performances that coexist with Fado shows. And these practices reveal a complex and dynamic sonic landscape where heritage tourism and everyday, maybe I should say every nightlife, intersect constantly. At the same time, Alfama is a deeply contested space. The spread of short-term rentals has transformed the uses of the built environment and replaced the residents with visitors, reshaping the neighborhood social fabric. And in parallel, heritage commodification increasingly mobilizes both tangible and intangible cultural assets to renew urban areas, enhance attractiveness, and foster cultural identity. These strategies, while reinforcing Alfama's visibility, tend to frame heritage in ways that privilege tourism over everyday life. Within this tension, music becomes a key arena, and while Fado is projected as one of the emblems of Lisbon tourist imaginary, grassroots practices continue to sustain community bonds and negotiate belonging. My research centers on the area around the church and Miradouro, which means viewpoint of Santo Estêvão, as the lyrics of Fernando Mauricio's 1977 Fado Igreja de Santo Estêvão remind us. The Miradouro has historically been a site of late-night convivial music making, and this location remains a key node of the musical sociability of the area. Today, it's hosts a plurality of genres and community-based gatherings. So this research asks three main questions. How do musical practices emerge in Alfama's everyday life across formal and informal settings? How do these practices negotiate or challenge dominant narratives of heritage and tourism? What role does music play in creating belonging and community among residents, newcomer, immigrant communities, musicians, and also tourists? This is an ongoing ethnographic study, and methodologically it combines participant observations, semi-structured interviews, sonic recordings, and photography. Observation focuses not only on the music but also on the social dynamics surrounding it within a shared uses of space. Interviews with the residents, musician, and visitor provide insights into experiences and perceptions of this particular area of Alfama's musical nightlife, while sound recordings and photographs document the sonic and the spatial context of the performances, allowing to understand music as both a sonic and social practice of placemaking. This ethnographic approach is applied to three distinct empirical cases: two semi-formal music venues and one informal open urban space. The cases were selected to show how different configuration of rules, participation, and physical contexts shape musical practices, form conviviality, and the translocal circulation of musicians. The analysis highlight how spaces with varying degrees of formalization mediate social relationships, create opportunities for musical experimentation, and sustain collective life even in urban context under pressures of gentrification and night regulation. The first case I will address is Tipica del Fama, which evolved from a neighborhood cafe into a semi-formal musical hub. Around 2019, it began hosting ensaios abertos, which means open rehearsal of informal roda de samba, which gradually developed into a more regular and structured weekly program. Performances remain semi-structured. Each band organizes its own set differently, often inviting participation from other musicians in the audience. On the slide, the slashes that you can see indicate that the bands perform every other week. And the public is diverse, including long-term residents, neighborhood regulars, casual tourists drawing by the music from the street, and musicians arriving from other gigs as the venue stays open until 2 a.m. Typica operates as a space for informal musical experimentation, mediating social interaction and enabling different, in quotation marks, bubbles of musicians, as one interviewee described them, to meet and collaborate. The second case I will focus on is Tejo Bar, a bar and restaurant with a tradition of informal live music and but with stricter rules. For example, photographs, recordings, and applause are not allowed, and the silence reminds of the ambience of a Casa de Fado. Participation remains informal, yet follows structured rotation in which musicians seated in the audience volunteer to perform a limited number of songs. This system generates highly eclectic repertoires within a single set. It can often moving across a vast range of genres. And significantly, participation is not restricted to guests. Bartenders and door attendants regularly contribute as performers, reinforcing a sense of belonging. And each evening concludes around 2 a.m. with the same Brazilian song performed by the owner, a ritual that consolidates memory and tradition within the venue. The audience is composed of a heterogeneous mix of long-term regulars, touring musicians, including well-known names who occasionally appear, and tourists. And despite its popularity among tourists, Tejo Bar maintains a discreet presence. There is no sign, no open door, and no outward indication that live music take place inside. In contrast to Tipica, where many passerbys enter spontaneously, those who attend Tejo Bar generally do so with a prior knowledge of expectation, reflecting its inclusion in some kind of touristic circuits. At the same time, the venue remains outside the dominant narratives of heritage and tourism, maintaining an important role as a space of encounter and musical exchange. The last empirical case that I am presenting today is the Miradouro of Santo Estêvão itself. It is an urban space that can be understood as the extension of the nearby venues, particularly after the enforcement of earlier bar closing time at 2 a.m. Historically, this square was already known as a nocturnal gathering place for fadistas once the Casa de Fado closed. And today it continues to host spontaneous late-night sessions, consolidating its role as an informal hub for musical practices in Alfama. And what makes the Miradouro distinctive is the fluidity of its musical activity. For instance, there are no fixed schedules, no defined lineups, and no pre-established repertoires. At times, there are just portable speakers to create the background music for the night and the social gatherings. The square also attracts a heterogeneous mix of participants, touring musicians often join after formal concert elsewhere in Lisbon, while audiences flowing from nearby venues to extend their night. Tourists are usually drawn into this nocturnal movement following people rather than any advertisement, since nothing is formally organized or promoted. The Miradouro thus becomes a space of encounter where different publics and musical contexts converge. I won't be able to read the testimony, but I found it really interesting because it illustrates the broader tension shaping Alfama today. On one hand, the increase of gentrification and the commercialization of music for tourism. On the other, the persistence of space like the Miradouro, where practices of conviviality, informality, and musical experimentation still survive. So in conclusion, Alfama's musical scene shows how informal and semi-formal practices mediate the tension between heritage commodification and every night life. Here, music is not only entertainment, it is also a way of engaging with the city, sustaining conviviality, emotional exchange, and cultural negotiation. And these practices challenge the Fado-centric image of the neighborhood, though they do not exclude the Fado itself from the practices. And they reveal how live music helps to maintain community bonds, negotiate belonging and urban identity, and counter the reductive tourism and heritage narratives. In this sense, Alfama exemplifies how music can act as a resource for resilience and cultural negotiation in rapidly transforming urban contexts. Thank you very much for your attention, and I concluded my presentation.
All right. So thanks for having me. So my name is Timo Koren. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam in the cultural studies department. And this research I did together with Miguel Neiva, who's a PhD student at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and also Alina Tomesco, who's a freelance researcher. Miguel is here today also in the call, but Alina could not be here. But so I'll be presenting this research, which is basically kind of departing from this idea of nightclubs, and specifically this whole idea of like the increasing number of policies, specifically in Berlin and Amsterdam, around nightlife, and that kind of like seeks to stimulate nightlife. And what we're particularly interested in actually in this sort of paper is how nightclubs respond to these sort of like policy developments. What do they actually think about that themselves? So yeah, I guess in this discussion or when we were sort of like starting this project with Alina and Miguel, one of the main things we were discussing was this whole sort of indeed like what Adam Eldridge also talked about, this whole discourse about like club closures, and also what Ben Esther calls this narrative of decline. So we're seeing these articles indeed where like you could say electronic dance music hubs like Amsterdam and Berlin are seen as under big pressure, right? There's all these sort of alarming signals. There's this word of Clubsterben in Germany, in Berlin specifically. So yeah, what I'm interested in here, I guess, not necessarily indeed like the sort of drivers behind that we know, of course, gentrification, inflation, high rents, densification, lack of space, festivalization, all these drivers. But what I'm kind of interested in mostly is actually how these kind of like discourses also probe a specific policy response. So what you see when these sort of like discourses are rising is that indeed from like let's say local governments, there's a heightened sort of sense that yeah, something needs to be done about this, and something needs to be done to stimulate nightlife. Yeah, in an earlier paper with Brian Rex, my colleague from Southampton, and also my PhD supervisor at the time, this whole sort of idea of club closures, we kind of like reframed it to this idea of adaptation. So what you see here in Amsterdam is that in the city center, actually, lots of clusters of nightclubs continue to exist, but they very much adapt commercially. So, for example, electronic dance music clubs that are really focusing on DJs that are typically more expensive, where typically customers drink less, are able to sort of like stay in the center of, are not able to stay in the center of Amsterdam and are actually moving outwards. Whereas some of these venues, for example, then change to becoming like what we then term like eclectic clubs, so clubs that focus on other more, I guess, commercially oriented genres or hit-oriented genres, such as like dancehall or R&B. So we see kind of like some urban change. We see this adaptation in clubs, and we see, for example, that indeed some of these city center clubs are explicitly starting to catering around tourists, but not necessarily that in the city center clubs are disappearing. But what we do see is a certain sort of inter-urban dispersal, which is that like these outside of this city center, we see like clubs sort of like popping up and then indeed like disappearing again within this sort of like wider discourse of the extractive economy, right? So like a club sort of increases the value of place. Then at some point, urban developments come close, and sort of the value is sort of transferred and siphoned off elsewhere. So I guess this is the sort of the story of Amsterdam, and I guess indeed also how we can sort of like understand these moves within policy. They're not necessarily oriented towards preserving all of nightclubs or all of nightlife, but they're simply usually oriented towards preserving like a specific subcultural form of nightlife. So yeah, we also see these policy responses in Amsterdam and in Berlin. So for example, here on the photo in Amsterdam, we see near Rembrandtplein that there's a private-public partnership called the Institute for Night Culture, which is also oriented towards preserving like a very specific type of, or like creating kind of like a specific type of venue, like relatively small, room for experiment, basically a place where talent can nurture. In Berlin, we see in UNESCO cultural heritage status for techno. Again, another sort of like policy response of trying to preserve a very specific type of nightlife. Yeah, so I guess that is sort of like this whole story of, on the one hand, there's this sort of like discourse of club closures, but on the other hand, we see actually arise sort of in these cities, at least in policy initiatives. And also they're becoming much more sort of like culture-led policies. So they're actually like nightlife policy used to perhaps in the past be focused on regulation, but now we also see that nightlife policy is increasingly starting to look like cultural policy. So basically very much looking at the sort of like cultural values of nightlife and also looking at what kind of cultural values make nightlife specific. Then in the sort of like academic literature, uh, s- we also can sort of like see a lot of different discourses indeed around this topic and around like how nightlife and how subcultural nightlife can flourish. And I'm kind of like contrasting two models here, two ways of thinking, you could say, within academic research and beyond. And the first is what Johan Andersson, the geographer, calls the archipelago. And here on the map in Berlin, you kind of see like well, first you see there's the former wall in Berlin, which kind of like left a void, which led to a sort of like scattering of nightclubs that you see here on these numbers that are all located where the former Berlin Wall used to be. And this sort of is like this sort of archipelago pattern, which and all these clubs they could be there because of a range of reasons, so an abundance of space, empty space, cheap rent, creatives present, the sort of history of a squatting culture. These all provided like these kind of conditions for a scene to emerge, which first started in Mitte in Berlin, but then kind of like moved more eastwards. So from ABC to like D and beyond, it moved more eastwards on the banks of the river Spree. And yeah, this sort of idea is that this temporariness also is kind of like part of nightlife and also is part of like sort of why nightlife continues to innovate and continues to be interesting. And you kind of see that archipelago thinking also in Amsterdam. So for example, there's the organization Post-CS-BV, and they were the people behind first Club 11, Club 11, then Trouw, then the school. So kind of they're one company, but they're making use of like temporary spaces and they're moving across the city. Now, of course, there's this idea here present in this archipelago model that nightlife really flourishes in a deregulated environment. So there's a capacity kind of like to build these social worlds simply because there's a relative lack of interference of the state. And it's not as regulated as these sort of like traditional nightlife districts, like for example, the Leidseplein in Amsterdam. And because it's this sort of like archipelago model, this sort of like transient, ever-changing model, there's kind of like more freedom to create. There's kind of maybe you could say in more traditional terms, there's more autonomy for nightclubs. But the archipelago model also comes with very specific challenges because in European cities, it's often sort of criticized because this model kind of strengthens gentrification, it increases the place value of certain locations, and because of densification in European cities, there's also less and less empty space. So these clubs need to move out further and further. And these remote locations then provide like a specific challenge to clubs as well, because they simply have to put in more work to attract audiences and to convince audiences to travel all the way to the nightclub. Then we also see this like sort of second development happening, which is this institutionalization or institutional model, which very much follows this logic of preservation. So here, indeed, nightlife is really following like sort of more traditional roots of cultural policy. There's this idea that nightlife needs to be sustained and preserved, for example, through cultural recognition, funding schemes, subsidies, tax breaks. So, for example, in Berlin, there are there are specific funding schemes around like noise regulation, for example. And then this also comes with specific nightlife advocates often. So like there's these club commissions or the night mayor or the night czar the night mayor in Amsterdam or the night czar in London. And there's an idea like in this way also subcultural nightlife can be promoted. But again, also this sort of like domain of policy is also sometimes criticized because in this instance, indeed, like subculture nightlife really has to position itself in negotiation or in relation to like government norms and practices. So there's this sort of like question of like can nightlife really foster those specific experimental qualities, which are kind of also a part of things that governments typically do not want, such as staying up late and being unhealthy. And then there's sort of, I guess, this indeed like this idea of this question of capital, which is continues to sort of like linger. Um, and to what extent indeed can cultural policies actually free nightclubs from the demands of the market, and to what extent can they do that? So this then sort of like leads to the research question, because then what we were interested in is indeed like how nightclubs respond to these sort of like policy models, and or like these ideas of thinking about like how nightlife can flourish, and specifically, of course, as development towards more institutional models of nightlife policy. That's the question, like how do nightclub and external promoters in Amsterdam and Berlin understand and negotiate the institutionalization of club cultures into cultural policy, into urban cultural policy. And specifically, we're understanding that this question in terms of how promoters respond to these changes in terms of their, or how they see this in how they see these changes in terms of their own economic and political autonomy. So very quickly, we interviewed both promoters in Amsterdam, 36, and 28 Berlin-based promoters, and also conducted a document-based analysis to also get a better historical picture, and also to kind of like attune for the time the time difference, because the interviews in Amsterdam were conducted in 2019, whereas the interviews in Berlin were conducted in 2024. So first of all, a very sort of like brief overview of like these differences between Amsterdam and Berlin. I think the sort of crucial thing here is that it is indeed like slightly different, and I think both policies are culture-led, culture-driven. They're very much about the cultural values of nightlife, but they're organized in quite different ways. So, for example, in Amsterdam, there's a night mayor, which then chairs a night council, which is made up of representative organizations and citizens. Then in Berlin, there's the club commission, which is more of a member organization. So they do receive and use money from the state, but also from membership fees. So it's actually much more of like a representative organization for nightclubs. And we also see that as sort of like advocacy organizations, these sort of organizations play like a different role. So in Amsterdam, it's much more this idea of a facilitator or broker role that these organizations play, or that the council, the city council typically plays. So it's much more, for example, about basically looking for like how can we arrange the conditions for nightclubs to emerge. So for example, there's the broedplaatsen policy, which is about empty space, which then cultural entrepreneurs can rent for cheap and sort of like develop. And this is also part of like a gentrification tool as well. But like this is indeed like how we see that Amsterdam is trying to sort of like promote nightclubs. And indeed, you could say it's also very much of an entrepreneurial logic. And in Berlin, we see that a lot of like nightlife organizing and also a lot of nightlife policies are actually following more like traditional subsidizing roles. So, for example, tax breaks, and also it's very there's also like a sort of preservationist logic present, you could say. So it's much more about like how can we make sure that these nightclubs can stay where they are, and how can we make sure, so for example, noise protection, heritage status, like we kind of see like these more preservationist attitudes in Berlin. Then I think in Amsterdam, what we've seen is that despite this sort of like more entrepreneurial logic, we see that indeed cultural elements are becoming more and more complex. Whereas in Berlin, we see that this heritage discourse is also increasingly economic. So it's also, for example, connected to tourism. And you see in these sort of like stories about Berlin often that indeed nightlife brings in, let's say, 2.8 billion euros, for example, to the city. And like you see in this way like how certain nightlife is justified. Then yeah, in these promoter interviews, and this is kind of like also the end of the paper, we see that what do they make of this institutionalization process? And I think one of the sort of main thing is that when we were talking to promoters, you see a lot of ambivalence actually. So there's a strong cultural memory, you could say, which is sort of like this rave DIY ethos, and there's also like this dynamism that we associate with this archipelago model, and you could see this as a sort of like longing for cultural, for economic autonomy. So this idea of like being able to create social worlds without being limited by the state. And indeed, for example, there's this quote from a Berlin-based promoter who said that his club was becoming more and more dependent on fundings, especially since COVID, and to the point where they have like a specific staff member to write funding application. He said that this is like sort of like a dangerous game, and it's also very contingent, for example, on very specific political tendencies and developments. And I think this sort of like contingency is also important in that sense. simply because we also see that nightlife policy is also very much happening in relation to other types of policy, and it might not always prevail over specific forms of policy. So, for example, Berlin is very famous for not having any curfews, but in practice, we see that because there's also lots of laws around noise regulations, that specific nightclubs actually need to think a lot about like how they sort of function. So, for example, there's clubs that say that they don't program any music with drums or saxophones. There's clubs that don't do any live music after 10 p.m. So there's all these different like limitations that happen in other ways. And also, for example, in what we see in the picture on the screen is that there's a motorway being built in Berlin, which is also threatening a few clubs, the A100 motorway. So we also see here that other types of urban policies are actually more becoming more and more well, kind of like prevail over nightlife policy, which is also sort of making promoters skeptical and thinking like to what extent indeed will nightlife policy increase our economic autonomy in the long run. Then, yeah, I think it's also important to not think about autonomy only like in terms of the economy, but also in terms of political autonomy. And I think especially when I was doing these interviews in Berlin in 2024, autonomy was also very much about political autonomy. And when we were sort of like starting this research, I had not expected necessarily to write about the genocide in Gaza, but in these Berlin interviews, it was a sort of like theme that kept coming up, and I think it also kind of like speaks to a sort of important part of nightlife more generally, which is kind of like its ability to foster a politics that goes against the wishes of the state or the dominant role of the state. So, for example, when we're thinking about nightlife historically and what it's done, for example, in terms of AIDS awareness during the AIDS crisis. So yeah, I think one of the sort of more important things to sort of like realize that in Berlin this topic came up frequently and always with a bit of hesitance because Israel is very much seen as part of Germany's Staatsräson, so there's a very close connection between the German state and the Israeli state. And sometimes indeed promoters were expressing this sort of anxieties to kind of like lose cultural funding, which also for example, if they would let's say make like a very explicit political statement around Israel-Palestine during the festival, and then, for example, this anxiety also came to be because in December 2023, the Senator for Culture, Joe Chialo, proposed a clause on the recognition of the State of Israel as a prerequisite for cultural funding. Now, this clause was eventually deemed unconstitutional, but it did sort of like show how this continues to sort of like impact Berlin organizers. Also, the Club Commission, so the main advocacy body, made a statement which was criticized by some of the respondents that we interviewed for not representing the diversity of voices in the nightclub sector. And the sort of one of the sort of critical voices said that this was this sort of like statement by the Club Commission was kind of a form of respectability politics that tried to paint a good picture of the club scene in light of the sort of like hegemonic opinion of the German government. So I think, yeah, the sort of like importance here is that like some of these promoters actually explained because of this whole discourse that they were kind of like moving away from like, for example, institutional club institutions like Berghain when organizing their parties. They were also kind of like thinking more about like archipelago type venues, unlicensed venues to organize their parties, simply because they were sort of like afraid that in a sort of like more institutional context, they would be held to scrutiny and would not be able to organize these types of events anymore. So we really see that this inspired sort of like specific negotiation of political autonomy, which I think also is something to be wary about when we're thinking about nightlife policy and the institution of nightlife policy, and indeed like the fact that nightlife policy and sort of institutionalizing nightlife might not always be a good thing, and we really need to think about like these issues that these promoters raise in that sense in this regard. So yeah, to sort of like wrap it all up. Hopefully, I didn't go over time. I actually forgot to check. There's I think when we're thinking about like this institutionalization of nightlife into cultural policy, there's place-specific trajectories. I think so. They really follow sort of existing paths of cultural policy. We see in Amsterdam a more sort of entrepreneurial culture-led nightlife policy, where in Berlin it's more preservationist. And I think this also reflects tendencies in cultural policy more generally. Then when we're thinking indeed about like this idea of autonomy and how promoters respond to these changes, I think there's a lot of ambivalence, specifically because this sort of like archipelago idea also with promoters is still very strong. There's maybe forms of nostalgia, there's cultural ideals going on. It's very much desired, you could say, both in terms of economic autonomy and political autonomy. But at the same time, there's this awareness that there's this extractive economy going on where, yeah, nightlife has only so much space to maneuver. There's all these urban processes like gentrification and densification. So there's also a sense that this archipelago ideal is increasingly unfeasible. Okay, thank you very much. And I put my email address there if you want to get in touch later about this paper. And